The city of Melbourne could land another major job hub as Northrop Grumman shops for a site for an engineering and design center. But that growth may require some economic incentives that have been the subject of scrutiny lately. My guest today, new Melbourne City Manager Mike McNeese, explains the potential deal. I also questioned him about the progress on US 1 construction, waterfront development, and McNeese's interesting previous job as CEO of US Track and Field. Take a look. Well, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Melbourne? You've been around there for about 3 or 4 months now. What have you observed?
Right. Well, I think like most cities in Florida, continuing to respond to revenue situations as the property values have flattened out considerably and at least have stopped declining is, I think, probably the biggest challenge. And I keep saying I won't really understand the city of Melbourne until I go through a budget. That is at least from the government side, from the operational side. And we're about to launch the budget this summer. So continuing to face those budget challenges as we have 3 union contracts to negotiate this summer, and as we try to solve the issues and meet the needs of those employees and that are represented, and also balance the budget is probably, I think, the first thing on the agenda. Is it a challenge? Yeah, I suppose. I mean, that's what the job is. Feel a lot better about it today than if I had to do the same thing maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. I think a lot of credit has to go to the city council and the city manager and the staff in the years immediately preceding. The former city manager, Jack Schluckbeer, and staff and the council working together did a fantastic job of keeping the financial house in order, being conservative, doing the things they needed to do to respond. And so we're not facing, massive holes or big cutbacks as we go forward. And so it's just about trying to continue to manage that good stewardship as we go forward and adapt to conditions as we get information this summer from the property appraiser. And so the immediate challenge, I think, is that continuing the good work on the economic development side, working with the EDC, the airport, definitely is a big part of what's on the menu going forward, and just steering the ship of the city.
One of the biggest news items about Melbourne or involving Melbourne in the past week or so has been the deal with Northrop Grumman and a design center.
Mm-hmm.
There's some incentives involved for Melbourne. Explain that.
Well, Melbourne's piece of that puzzle is to provide some, actually a little bit unusually, some upfront grant funding over a 4-year period for Northrop Grumman as matching funds to some state-level economic development incentives that are available to them. Now, I say up front, nothing is actually money to Grumman up front. It's granting them contingent upon certain milestone activities on their part, capital investment in building and equipment, and the relocation of employees here, new employees to Brevard County over a 4-year period. And as they reach certain milestones, then they're eligible for those city incentives as they go forward. So
I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a second, but what will be there? What is this design center? What kind of work is going to happen? What kind of jobs are we looking at?
Exactly what those jobs are, I can't tell, I can't say. But they're higher end jobs, engineering, design, technical jobs. Average, the number that I got was the average is $70,000 and up for those jobs. So they're high paying, both technical and design jobs. So that are really the kind of jobs we need here that will support a lot of ancillary business and have a great trickle-down effect to the rest of the city and southern Brevard.
1,000 jobs, I think, was the number that I saw. Yeah,
there have been some different numbers bouncing around, and I've been reading some effort to reconcile, well, in this city they say they're losing a certain number, and in that city they're gaining a different number. I don't know exactly what the number is. What I do know is that the incentives from the city of Melbourne are triggered by very specific deliverable thresholds. And so whether it ends up being 1,000 or 800 or 700 or 1,100, the incentives from Melbourne will only be triggered by specific numbers of jobs.
Okay.
With the high end being probably what we're aware of, 1,000. Now, could it be more in the future? Certainly. Could it be a few less than that in the future? Certainly. I mean, there's no hard commitment, but if they don't meet that level, then they don't receive all the incentives in the package.
The numbers that Florida Today reported were a $1.12 million grant and a $474,000 property tax break, but that's over 4 or 5 years
It's over
or so.
a 5-year period, right? And I know people are very sensitive about those kind of incentives, and so it was important to us to structure that incentive in a way that it wasn't just unsecured money up front, but it was rather triggered by specific investments by Northrop, and we thought that was important. And we also wanted to be able to calculate out a pretty solid return on investment, because we see those things as investments, not as grants. And so we wanted to be able to see that there is a good return, and it's difficult to value what is the value to the community of the location of one $70,000 a year job. Well,
right.
You know, it's very hard to put a number on that.
Depends on where the people choose
right,
to live, where
they
do their
exactly,
shopping.
Exactly. And so, but at the very minimum, that's either buying or renting a house if it's a new family, and a fair amount of trickle down. But even without trying to put a specific number on each job, we wanted to know that directly from an ad valorem tax standpoint, that whatever grant we were to give would provide a fair return, specifically in ad valorem revenue from the company in the future.
I see.
And we ciphered that out fairly carefully and feel like that it's a really good, solid business deal for the city of Melbourne. So we're excited about Northrop Grumman. Some of their folks their corporate relations folks came to see us, government relations folks to see us last week, the mayor and I. And we're excited about the footprint they want to establish even more in southern Brevard. So we think it's exciting.
Where is this engineering and design center going to be located?
That's the $20,000 question, or should I say the $1.29 million question. I know they're working that right now, and we're all very anxious to see what they end up doing. Is it building? Is it renovating something existing? And I suspect that we'll hear about that before too long. But I can't tell you exactly, because I don't know where their footprint will be, but it'll be interesting to find out.
One of the other issues that has been a big one for Melbourne, I know you wrote an op-ed piece about it, was the construction along US 1. I heard that we reported that part of New Haven that had been blocked off there by orange barrels was supposed to be back to semi-normal sometime this month.
Sometime this month.
Can you give us a status report?
Well, I think that is the status report, where Jenny Lamb, the city engineer, did a really good job working with the State Department of Transportation to kind of tweak that project to see how could they get some completion earlier than they were estimating. And so they promised by June 1st and didn't promise, but suggested that earlier than that was a possibility. So we keep watching in May. We're hoping that that'll be wrapped up down in that area. You know, we hate to be critical of the DOT because they're investing in the infrastructure in the city. They did a fantastic job with the repaving and the improvements along US 1 to the north of New Haven, all the way up towards O'Galley Boulevard and past there. And that was my route to work for a while, and managed that really well, it seemed like, where traffic wasn't affected much. Down there in the New Haven area, frankly, I think it just wasn't as well planned as it could have been, and working going forward, we want to work with the DOT a lot better to identify business impacts. I think people down there are pretty tired of it at this point, and so getting the DOT out of there will be great, but we appreciate the DOT's investment in downtown, and we think that improvement, it's a stormwater improvement specifically that I think has taken a lot of the time, and along with the road work that goes with it. But they'll be out of there pretty soon, and God bless those merchants down there for their patience, and thank Jenny for helping goose that a little bit along the way to get them out of there. So hopefully in the next few weeks they'll be finished. And I mean, I know when I came here to first interview for this job, which was, I don't know, November or so of 2012, it was all torn up, and I came back to look for a house and it was still torn up, and now here I am 3 or 4 months on the job and it's still torn up. So I can imagine people down there are coming and going from the island, and the merchants and the customers are probably over it by now. So soon they'll be done.
You have an interesting background. Tell us a little bit about where you came from before you were city manager of Melbourne.
Well, I'm born and raised Hoosier, and went to school at Indiana University, a graduate school over in Louisiana, a place called Louisiana Tech, and ended up in the private sector down in Naples in the early 80s. And when I was in my 20s, ended up taking a job as the sort of the bottom of the chain in Collier County government. So as Naples exploded in the 80s and 90s, I worked my way up through Collier County government, ended up leaving there in 2001 as the deputy city manager, or deputy county manager, assistant county manager, the COO down there in Collier, to be the city manager in Sarasota. So I did that for about 6 years, and left Sarasota, took a job as the county manager up in Blaine County, Idaho, which is the Sun Valley area. The mountains were kind of calling me, so I went up there and did that work and learned how to fly fish and ski, and had some fun up in the mountains for a couple of years. Then took a little detour, had an opportunity to go to work for an organization called USA Track and Field, national governing body for the sport of track and field, and I went back to Indianapolis actually to do that for 1 year as the chief operating officer, and then I did 2 years as the interim chief executive officer of USA Track and Field, and ran that company then for a couple of years before they finally found a permanent CEO to take that position, and which brings me to Melbourne. So,
is USA Track and Field is that connected to the Olympic teams, or is it a circuit of privately sponsored events? How does that work?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's the national governing bodies are designated by the National Olympic Committee, the U.S. Olympic Committee. For each sport, there's a designated national governing body who's responsible for selecting, outfitting, and producing an Olympic team every 4 years. Now, of course, along with that, then you have international teams in all different types of events and different age groups, different sports, cross country, mountain running, and all those kind of things. You have youth programming, and then also on the business side, an organization like that, one like USA Track and Field at least, which is a fairly large NGB, runs a merchandise program, and 57 state associations that are affiliated, state and local associations that are affiliated, and so some 100 to 120,000 members nationwide who do everything from compete to coach, officiate, and who are involved in the sport at all levels. So it's a kind of a diverse organization, of which the Olympic program and producing and selecting the Olympic team every 4 years is one of the key, is what makes them the national governing body.
So is Melbourne going to take over the lead from Gainesville as the track and running capital of Florida?
No, I don't think that's really in our wheelhouse, even though it might be interesting to me. Although I think what we can do in building and developing our special events hopefully can be benefited by some of the experience I've had, and stay tuned for that. Will we be track and field capital? No, we don't really have the facility or that's not, but there are other things we can be. I mean, certainly the music marathon is one of those special events that has a huge economic benefit to Brevard County, and the more we can groom and integrate those things with the community and make sure that that the benefit is as broad as it can possibly be to bringing those bodies into Brevard. I look forward to working on those kind of things.
One of the areas that I know has been a hoped for development is along US 1 south of Crane Creek. Is there any activity actually planned or going on down there? What have you learned thus far?
There is an enormous amount of activity related to US 1 in both directions from New Haven. Keen observers, as they drive up and down, they will test you and see how keen your observance is.
Okay.
As you drive from north of New Haven in this direction, there has been a lot of cleanup along the lagoon bank there between US 1 and the lagoon of exotics, and the city's working very aggressively to clean up exotics on all the property that we own along there. And there have even been some of the private sector individuals who've kind of been motivated by that effort who are doing it on their own. We're in the process of continuing to acquire land along there for what ultimately will be a view corridor linear park along there that somewhere down the road, hopefully, there's already a plan, a tentative plan for it, will include a boardwalk and a place people can take a walk in the evening or watch the sunrise in the morning, and really be a nice amenity for Melbourne. And of all the things I think Melbourne has under leveraged, it's probably its waterfront. So that's an example of where we can really make some, without a lot of investment, make some real noticeable improvements. And just people are noticing that they're just getting the Brazilian peppers out of there and being able to see the vista as you drive through there is an enormous improvement. So that wasn't your question. Your question was New Haven to the south. The Riverview Park that the city acquired from the county has been cleaned up, and the process is about to kick off for some master planning of that park, where people have an opportunity to come down and say what they think should be in there. Okay. Should it be non-motorized boat rentals, canoe, kayak launches, what kind of passive and/or activities should be in there as that park's redeveloped. So that'll be another opportunity to leverage our waterfront and give people in South Melbourne a nice way to connect and throw their paddleboard in the water, get a kayak and put it in the water, whatever that might be. In addition, the downtown CRA, I understand, is something I just learned the other day, is looking at some planning for that corridor you're talking about, US 1 to the south, how to dress that up. And there's some good business in there. There's some, there's a nice German restaurant along there, and even though it's industrial, that is now my route to work. I come from the south now, and so as I go, since I get to go every day, I learn a little more every time almost. But there's some good solid business in there, and some people who are already doing their part to improve the aesthetics of that area. And it's an interesting challenge because there's industrial in there, and there's there's certainly nothing wrong with having an industrial frontage. But we can work to dress it up, and I think that's what the CRA is interested in, and what can we do in terms of hardscape, landscape, what are those things, but that's on the menu as well. So then that is all about building the beauty of Melbourne for those, and making people who are just cruising through on US 1 know Melbourne because they know when they got there, and get them to think about slowing down a little bit and maybe coming downtown or go to O'Galley or wherever that might be. But it's all about improving that sort of experience of coming through Melbourne. And for the locals, we all drive US 1 one time or another, some of us every day, and so it's all about our own daily experience too.
You mentioned earlier in the program that you have 3 big contracts that you're negotiating coming up with different unions, I suppose, with the city. What are they, and how are things going with that?
Well, we have the fire union, the IAFF, International Association of Firefighters contract, has been under negotiation, and we're in the process of bringing them back to the table. And I think it kind of stalled going with the transition of managers, and And so we'll get them back to the table and get that contract worked out. We will be reopening the contract for the police union here over the summer, and they've let us know they're ready to reopen that, and so that one's coming, and have spoken informally with some of their leadership, and acknowledge that yes, we know we've got to do that this summer. And then there's a fairly small general employees union that covers some of the what you might call blue collar folks that is upcoming sometime in the next 6 months. Hopefully we won't have to do them all three simultaneously, but look forward to those processes and getting them underway and sitting down to understand the needs and how we can solve. To me, those are really problem-solving exercises. The union can help communicate to us. We have an idea what our pay and benefit structure is about and how it works, and they feed back to us whether it works for them or doesn't work for them, and we problem solve what needs to be adjusted and how we can solve our issues.
One of the issues that came up in the legislature this year was pension reform, and I'm not sure what kinds of changes could pass, if any, this year, but to what degree are pensions an issue for Melbourne? Well,
they are an issue, and my understanding is that there may not be pension reform that passes Tallahassee this year.
Okay.
And we'll see, but they're not quite, they haven't breathed their last breath yet, but I don't think so. There's no doubt that in many cities, and in many Florida cities, pension benefits were awarded over time in the 60s and 70s and 80s as property values were increasing and as revenues were growing like crazy, and as workforces were young, that as economics have changed and as workforces have aged and retiree groups have grown, have become difficult to sustain for local governments. I don't think there's any big political sensitivity to me saying that. That's just a fact.
Right.
And so Melbourne doesn't have acute catastrophic problems in those areas, but we do have issues with the increasing cost of those kind of plans, and it's also included being, the returns on the investments in those plans haven't been in the last 10 years what they might have been in the 20 years before that to keep them funded. So hence you get these conversations about changing to a defined contribution kind of a plan where the city puts in a specified amount of money that ultimately then comes back to those retirees when they retire, versus guaranteeing a specific revenue to the retirees when they retire, which means the city is at risk for the investment values and such. And so for new employees, those kind of conversations, those are the kind of things Tallahassee's looking at. But those conversations don't really affect existing retirees or people that have already worked for 20 or 25 years because commitments have been made to them. So managing how those plans will work and how we'll fund the needed contributions will certainly be a part of the conversation as we go through the contracts, because it's a finite amount of money, and there's a very limited appetite for any kind of tax increases, and so it's all about apportioning things out to accomplish the highest priority things. I don't think anybody feels like we should shrink services just to pay our employees more, because that's getting a little out of whack. So it's all a balancing act. And again, I haven't been through a budget yet for the City of Melbourne, and I'll learn a lot more about exactly precisely how those challenges are balanced for us as I go through it. And as I go through the 3 contract negotiations this summer, I'll be much more informed, hopefully wiser, and hopefully no more tired at the end of the next 5 or 6 months as we work through all that. But
which is when we'll be deciding, the city will vote and decide on the tax rates and those
the contracts, the tax rates, all those kind of things, right.
We have just a couple minutes. There was something interesting that popped up at the library parking lot in O'Galley just in the last month or so, an electric car charging station. More of those expected in Melbourne, or what's your take on
I think that's
that?
a really interesting question. plan is for that one to be at least a break-even proposition. I'm very, very interested to see utilization. And I'm a big believer in trial balloons and, you know, pilots, and let's see how this thing goes. And I obviously didn't have anything to do with this one, but I really like that we're doing one. And seeing what kind of traffic does it get, how much utilization is there. So I'd call that a stay tuned. You know, let's follow that. Let's see how it works. It's interesting, and let's see how much. Now I understand it'd probably be a more meaningful pilot if we could put 5 or 6 out, so we were a little bit covered a little more area, because it's a little random to think that, okay, the universe of electric cars will all be able to charge at O'Galley, so, you know, we can get a meaningful measure. So it's kind of anecdotal versus being really a scientific measure, but it'll tell us something. If nobody uses it, we'll learn something, but I don't think that's the case. It's already been used some, so.
It's tied into an app, a national app,
absolutely,
network that people can find it.
You can put it on your phone and find out where it is, and that's the kind of thing which I'm really glad you brought up. Those are the kind of things where the city of Melbourne can bring itself forward a little bit more into today, into the future, as we integrate better with some of the modern communication and electronic media and such. That's a perfect example where we've got our charger out there. It's on the national database, and those folks can find it. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Call me curious on that one. I'm really interested to see how it plays out.
Mike McNeese, thank you for joining us here
Thanks
today.
for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's our program. Remember to comment on anything you saw today. Send an email to letters@floridatoday.com. I'm Matt Reed. We'll see you right here next week on WBCC and FloridaToday.com.